Hello, and welcome to the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into Ron Howard's thrilling new movie, 13 Lives, which retells the heroic and harrowing story of the rescue of those 13 young Thai soccer players who were trapped in a flooded cave back in 2018. Joining us to discuss the movie is the man himself, Academy Award-winning director Ron Howard, as well as much of his post-production team. The film's editor, James D. Wilcox, re-recording mixers Chris Burden and William Miller, as well as supervising sound editors Rachael Tate and Oliver Tarney, the latter of whom also served as the movie's sound designer. 13 Lives is available to stream right now on Prime Video. This film has a truly extraordinary sound mix, and experiencing it in Dolby Atmos recreates the peril and the claustrophobia the real-life divers must have experienced in almost agonizing detail. So that was the name of the game for these filmmakers, authenticity, both because of the global attention that this story received, as well as the importance of honoring the memory of the folks who were lost in the rescue attempt. But crafting the film with that much attention to detail was not without its challenges, as director Ron Howard tells us.
It's been a pleasure to work on, honestly, and kind of inspiring. I mean, I've said this a few times, but I never had less complaining on any movie that I directed in my career than this one. And it was simply because I think everybody recognized that this was a unique opportunity to really offer audiences something, because it's a combination of things. It's suspenseful and it's emotional. It's enlightening, but what it really does is it recognizes, in a very human way, I think, what human beings are capable of, what's possible, with that kind of cross-cultural, commitment and cooperation. But it's also just that, most of the people involved didn't have to be there. And yet they made such a huge difference. And I also think that in this climate of kind of filmmaking and what's possible to get a green light on, I think we also felt fortunate to be able to have the resources at our disposal to really tell this story well. It was tight. We had to maximize those resources, but it was enough, just enough. And everybody really threw themselves into it. It was exciting for me as a director.
Obviously, this is a very well-known news story from 2018 that millions of people around the world followed. There was an acclaimed documentary, The Rescue, made about it, a PBS series. And it sounds like such a terrifying challenge to then come in and make a Hollywood film based on this same material, and not to mention the fact that it was going to be an enormously difficult movie to shoot. So what made you excited and made you want to say, yep, this is for me, I'm jumping on, I want to make this film?
Well, there were a number of things, because this is not something that I developed. It came to me. It was William Nicholson's script, sent to me by producers Gabby Tana and PJ Sandwick. My agents were very supportive of it. They loved the script. So did I. So it was a terrific creative opportunity, and but there were some red flags. It's a story that's very well known. I already knew their documentaries had existed, and more was happening. There were competing projects. There was a lot going on around it from a business standpoint to sort of raise question marks and concerns. The greatest one for me, honestly, was the Thai culture. Because the version of the script that I read wanted, and that I wanted to develop further, was going to demand even more Thai emphasis. I felt it was their story. I wanted to develop those characters, and through research, I just sensed that there was even more to reveal, and it turned out that I was right about that. But I knew that was coming with a huge challenge. because, I am who I am, and I don't speak Thai. But I've had just enough experience working in other cultures and languages to believe that if I made it a priority, that I could get that right. In fact, I was so grateful for all my previous experiences, whether it's underwater stuff from going back to Splash and Cocoon or In the Heart of the Sea, or whether it's the sort of the pressure of shooting in really claustrophobic environments from Apollo 13. As I said, the various different nationalities and cultures and languages from the Da Vinci Code movies. All of these things gave me confidence to believe if I brought my experience to this movie, I could do something with it that in and of itself would have value, which is to try to do a scripted version, a high profile one with great internationally known actors, and allow audiences on a really granular level to just have a sense of what it might have been like to be there. What did it feel like on that most humanistic level? And I think scripted narrative is one of the best ways to sort of open up those lines of empathy and understanding. Documentaries, and I love working on the documentaries. I was grateful for the documentary experience that I've had in recent years as well when it came to making this movie. But they are there to present as many facts as possible and to sort of blow you away with that information flow. And you could find those very entertaining. But, movies are there as an emotion machine and to connect it on that most human level. And that I felt like whatever anybody else did, we could do that. And the story was so important that I felt like that we could just contribute to sort of the way this story is remembered and understood.
Well, I really appreciate that answer, because it also kind of tees up the rest of our conversation, because as you say, that you're using the tools of narrative storytelling to really give people the experience. And obviously the soundtrack is a huge part of that. And especially in the underwater sequences, this team did just such a fantastic job of giving us that visceral experience of being underwater.
Well, they really did. I mean, and from the beginning, I knew I'd ask James to edit immediately, because I knew that just from working with him the couple of times that I have, that his great sense of character, and a wide array of characters and sensibilities, and just all the work that he's done leading up to this, I just knew he was equipped to really get at this in an interesting way, and in a way that I wanted to. But I also knew from my experience, especially on Apollo 13, but also on recent documentaries, that this is a movie where we were going to go out, explore it, shoot the hell out of it, get as much information as we could, get as many ideas as we could during our production period, and then really ultimately find that story that was going to have the drive, that was going to hold the suspense, that was going to contain the information plus the emotion in editing. And I knew that James would be incredibly helpful in that way, and he was very, very, very creative as we kept refining and discovering. And also, I felt like the sound had to be, that really needed to be a character in this, because we needed to create an environment. And I knew music could help, and I knew I could do, sort of whatever I could in shooting. But man, I also knew that the soundscape was going to be vitally important, not only in the cave, but also, in the camp itself, in that environment.
Obviously, almost the first 20 minutes of this film takes place in Thai, without any English language being spoken. So I was curious for you, from a picture editorial standpoint, how did you approach all the foreign language material and cutting performances in another language? And then same question, Rachael, for you in terms of editing all that dialogue.
Yeah, Glenn, I'll tell you, the first 16 and a half minutes of the film is exclusively in Thai. And when I read the script, I thought to myself, like, how can we begin to build some members of our team that may be of the Thai culture that could help us with language, could help us with culture, could help us with accuracies, and probably who was informed on the story. And I couldn't really come up, me or my team, my lead assistant, Simon Davis, we couldn't really find anyone in the Thai community. It was during lockdown, so our resources were kind of limited. But that was the thing that kept me up most at night, worrying about getting the language accurate and like pulling performances and misspeaking and ad-libs and just the proper intonation and emotion behind the lines. And Ron gives the actors a lot of leeway for improv. So the film feels really natural. But eventually what I developed was, in hearing the repetition of the dialogue and going across all the takes, I began to develop a bit of an ear for the rhythm of their language. And so I wouldn't touch that naturally when I began to cut it, because I didn't know if cutting up or pulling up pauses at that point in my first cut, what that would really do to their language. So I kind of left it. And then I worked a lot with Simon Davis on it, and he went across every one of the takes and subtitled each one of those lines there. So when there was a difference between take to take, I kind of could begin to hear it. And overall, I think the guiding light of it all, or the really the focus of it all for me sonically, was the emotion. Just the performances that our Thai cast members gave us, I could just feel my way through it. And once I was comfortable at about 5 minutes worth of story in the beginning, that I then asked for us to bring in a translator. And she came in and she watched that first 5 minutes, and I sat next door and continued working while she sat with Simon. And it was really interesting. After she left, I went over and asked Simon, how did we do? And he just gave me the thumbs up. He goes, there's a few things here and there. You know, I just slid one way or the other. But that was even tricky because that lady who came in to help us, she's not in the industry. She's actually from Bangkok. And she understood enough of what was said in that Northern Thai dialect to help us. But she was so emotionally invested in the story, Simon would turn to her and ask her, what did the governor say here? And she would be completely in tears. And so and she would say he said one thing and he got confused, and then he'd go back and play it back again. And then she would say, yes, he said what you want him to be saying. So we had that on our side. And then also Simon, to his credit, very, very organized. He had the Google Translator with him at all times, breaking down the Thai. And then our script was it was in English, but it was also phonetically broken down in Thai. So with the addition of those two tools and the translator, and then later on, we brought in other translators to vet the previous translator. So after a while, that no longer became my issue. It really became the other factors, all the moving parts of the story and how to get that in balance as we kept a sort of urgent timeline and pace going towards that final day 18.
Yeah, and talking about the Thai dialects, I didn't realize before I started that there's actually 4 different dialects in Thailand, and they are quite different. It's not just a slightly different accent, it's different timings and different words even. So we had to make sure, at Ron's behest, but quite rightly, that anyone in any part of Thailand would watch this and go, yes, those people from Northern Thailand sound like they should be from Northern Thailand, not like I say, it's like having a Texan in Canada. You can understand it, but it's quite different, and we can't mess that up. So we have to also remember this was shot in Australia during COVID. So yes, although the characters are Thai, some of them have an Australian accent in their Thai, that we needed to work with voice coaches prior to each ADR session. They had a lot of work with a voice coach. And then when we recorded, if they needed different words, different timings, because they would have done if they had to go from Central to Northern Thai, then fitting those in the mouth or picking words that would have the same meaning but the right mouth shape. Yeah, it's tricky. But the crowd was a little less tricky. We actually got a crowd recording session done in Northern Thailand, about 45 minutes from the cave. And that was with Alex Boyson, who's our sound editor, who lives over in Thailand. He's lived there for decades. And they did kids crowd for the football at the beginning. They did the farmers chopping the bamboo, every part of it. And they did a central Thai crowd for the officials and the Thai Navy SEALs. So it's all very specific. And we found out the other day, actually, Alex wrote to us when we got here, and he said that since doing the crowd recording, they've all become really good friends. This is just what it's like in Thailand. Everyone helps everyone, and they've all become really good friends. And they're going to have this film festival next week with 60 of them all showing up, and a big sheet up on the wall, outdoor projection. The minute the rainy season stops, he said that's what they're doing. And he said there's just an understanding with this film over there from the ones who have seen it, that because we paid such detailed attention to the dialect, that it is a great compliment to them, because they're not used to seeing that in a film, especially one from the West, you know. So they really appreciated that, and I'm glad he told me that. But I just love the idea of this film festival happening next week.
You know, as a mixer, having to mix all that material, you know, was that a specific challenge for you? How did you approach? I presume you're not fluent in Thai yourself.
No, I mean, in terms of the sort of technical approach, it would be a dialogue pre-mix. Sometimes I was left on my own. I would treat, some languages do sound quite different frequency-wise, and Thai certainly has a slightly more aggressive dynamic. So not even thinking about the actual content, there's a slightly different approach there. You know, just subtly different approach. The younger voices as well early on and so on. So to give this sort of, keep it a rich, interesting sounding, there was that aspect to it. And I was aware that there's a mixture of ADR and so on early on. In all honesty, you have to rely on the layers of people who are checking. You know, I would have subtitles and so on and so forth, but picking out characters. And again, when it's you know, there's maybe 14, 15 kids in a scene or smaller numbers, or the parents, and there were slight layers. Again, you'd be pull focus in terms of dynamic and so on, but you'd be reliant on subtitles being accurate and in the right place. Again, asking Rachael specifically, and then we're checking that what we've done. So you're a little bit blind in certain respects, and it harks back a lot of what James was saying. You get a sense of the emotional sort of shape, because you feel the human aspect whether you understand it or not. So the brilliant editing to bring it to that sort of emotional shape, and you're just making sure you retain that. So, and then as the film unfolds, there's less sort of minutes. The original first 20 minutes being solely Thai, that breaks down subsequently, so the English starts to, you know, be interwoven and so on. So that changes it. But yeah, a little bit different technically, but mainly further down the line, you just the sensitivity, the cultural, spiritual nature of this movie, you just want to get it right. And so it was checked. And when we finish certain reels, and we say, has that now been checked because there's new crowd gone in there or new lines or whatever. So,
James, I'd love to draw you in with some questions about editing. And I know that you had a staggering amount of footage, as Ron just mentioned, to work through and figure out how to structure the film. But I am really intrigued by the structure of the film and how you guys landed on that. You know, one of the things that really struck me is, you know, John and Rick are really the heroes of the film, but we don't even meet them until almost 20 minutes into the movie. So I feel like you guys were breaking some rules around structuring films. And can you talk about the challenge of that, and then how you ended up with the structure that you've got?
Oh, you mean Hollywood rules? We might have come from there, but we were never thinking of it. We were thinking of it as an international movie, and really, you know, as a movie for everyone. But go ahead, James.
No, I was just going to say, we wanted to throw rules out. You know, I think we were somewhat bound by the timeline of the actual events. And so with the amount of footage, we had lots of options on how we wanted to tell the story. There were times where we had narrative scenes and we could actually make the choice of we can show that in a different way. And we can introduce, as you said, we don't meet Vigo and Colin until, I don't know, nearly 20 minutes into the film. Because what we did initially by having the first 16 and a half minutes of it in Thai is it authenticated us as a different type of film. It almost felt like a foreign language film and told from the Thai point of view. And I think it was easy to follow and easy to meet those characters right off the bat. But in terms of like how we settled on structure, a lot of conversations about what we wanted in, what we didn't need, what the audience was able to get through our various screenings that could eliminate some of the redundancy and typically the pathway in and out of the caves underwater, that whole system going through the various chambers. It was Ron's idea to have them swimming in or diving in right to left. They would always go right to left, essentially for the most part, unless the camera was kind of center punched and they were approaching us, or we dropped back over their shoulder and they were going away from us. But that gave the audience, I think, a good sense of the geography. And then when they exited, it was always left or right. So you were never really kind of confused as to where the divers were at any point in the tunnel. And then there were various sort of pieces of dialogue and signposts and familiarity with where these divers would make it to. But in terms of overall rules, I just really wanted to do the unexpected. And I think through all of these revelations, it's what keeps people engaged across the length of the movie. Because you said earlier that it's a well-known story. It is. But what people don't know, people have seen the movie by now, is the details on how they got the kids out. Because that information was closely guarded and the parents were sent away and the media was sent away. And so that information was never truly revealed to the world. Most people in my research, my approach, seem to remember the kids came out alive, the kids in the coach, someone died. They roughly remember Elon Musk somehow was on the perimeter of the story. And that
everybody remembers Elon Musk.
That kind of was it. But when you look at the movie, we're telling such a chronicled, subjective point of view to the story that feels completely experiential and different. And what you thought you knew, even with the outcome, it's really the journey that helps us get there and helps audiences feel the claustrophobia and the danger and the anxiety and all the things that come along with a story like this, the rescue.
I thought it was very interesting, important, and this was there in Bill Nicholson's script to begin with, but a lot of it came through research and understanding the mechanics of it. Because a lot of what worked was very basic and very mechanical and kind of low tech, all the way to when the water engineer on the mountain has run out of pipe. And they're trying to build these little, with sandbags and shovels, basically these little dams, and divert the water away so they won't drip down into the sinkhole and make the flooding worse to try to buy the divers time. It's a kind of a simple idea once you understand it, except they ran out of pipe. And literally, local villagers, like these elders, said, we'll split bamboo in half and you can create these troughs. And we can build a lot of those because there's a lot of bamboo and let's get to work. And they actually did it. And, and so I loved celebrating that kind of problem solving. And I kept saying, this is a sort of an intersection between various degrees of technology, and then individuals' experience, and then also ability to improvise. And then there was the sort of the mental state of mind. Like, can you actually hold it together? Can you deal with this pressure well enough to actually execute this plan, which was dependent upon, a bit of luck and a lot of courage, and without any guarantee of a positive outcome, which just blew me away when I began to realize that they were doing all of this really in hopes that they could save one person. It's such an amazing story to get to share.
I just wanted to add one more thing to that. I think what you're seeing and what you're experiencing, the overall outcome of the film, is the connection that we all shared together in our understanding of the story and our respect for the Thai culture and our respect for, the real events and how we could creatively, in as much as an unexpected way, begin to immerse the audience in it. And we were all very connected from our very first Zoom call on.
Yeah. On into post-production. Into post-production, there was this sentence would happen. You'd say, they did that? Oh, geez, we got to get that in there. And it was that little those flashes of discovery, and it by the way, it played all the way into the sound design and other things that I know you want to talk about. But the interesting thing too was to really spread out the perspective, and that was an interesting challenge. I've done a lot of that over the years, but not in recent years, to be a kind of an ensemble movie that keeps shifting so that you keep understanding this crisis from slightly different perspectives, and to the point where by the end of the movie you actually understand this on a group level and what it means to a lot of people, not just a handful. And so I hope audiences respond to it that way. That was certainly a part of the creative excitement for me.
One of the things that immediately struck me, you talk about the two environments, the rescue and the underwater thing, and obviously what's happening outside. But the thing that struck me was there's a third environment as well, which is the boys and where they are in the cave. And Ron and James, you deliberately withhold that from us for a very long time in the movie. I was sort of like, okay, well, if I'm going to see Titanic, I expect to see the sequence where the ship hits the iceberg. So I kept expecting, I'm going to see the sequence where the kids, they get flooded and they have to swim but you didn't show us any of that. They're this presence that we don't see until the divers find them. And then I would love to hear you guys talk about the sound design, because you did a very interesting thing, which is where they are in the cave. It's a place of great stillness and almost serenity in a way, in contrast to everything that's going on around. And so I would love, Ron, for you to talk about, was that part of your original conception for how that was going to be structured? And then from the sound team, how you executed that?
Well, first I would just say, Bill Nicholson initially framed that. In fact, he had even less of the boys going in. I decided to shoot more of that and actually understand what the cave looked like and why it was a kind of an exciting, playground for them in a way, and why you could understand why they would want to go deeper, and also so you could differentiate the cave from when it's dry and when it was flooded. It's very different, environments. But then again, this was about getting into characters' perspectives, because Bill wrote it this way and I agreed with it. We didn't, while we all sort of know, that they got out in the end of the day, the conceit we're working with is that we're going to take you on the journey of those who didn't know what the outcome was, and you're going to align yourself with those people. And so for that reason, it was important to not give the audience that insight into where the boys were and whether they were okay. And it was a choice. It was a little controversial creatively, but Bill and I always landed on that, on that outcome. The environment, look, when it came to the environment, and especially sonically, but visually a little bit with Sayampu, the cinematographer, but really with this soundscape and this sound design, I really did just sort of speak in these cryptic terms and hope they could figure it out. Like it needs to be a character. Okay, Ron. The environments need to be different somehow, underwater and above water. So you guys should just talk about how you actually tackled the problem, because I was so excited when I began to get material back, and I just breathed a sigh of relief and felt like, well, they Oliver and Rachael get it. Thank God.
In terms of that one, I guess there was an element of it being the eye of the storm. There's all this turbulence and silt particles everywhere else, and they come up. And there was something about, for them to have that mental strength and emotional strength, that I think their coach used meditation a lot with the boys to keep them sort of grounded. It must have been incredibly harrowing thing to be trapped in there and basically in dark for that many days. So there was something that felt right about having that area feeling relatively calm compared to everything else as well, that it sort of fed into that idea that they've forced, despite everything that's happening, they've kind of forced, this environment that they all felt strong in, and it was relatively calm as well. So I think that was a nice dynamic between getting to that place was incredibly difficult, and there's water hitting them, caves closing in on them, tank clang, scrapes, everything else. But once you get to there, then it was about the divers and the boys, what the boys had been going through, and obviously the dialogue between, the boys and the divers, to start hearing that sort of relationship building.
And also, it's a dichotomy, really. The more you have this stillness inside the cave, outside the cave, the frenetic, the chaos of all these people showing up, it really plays as a two-hander. One influences the other, and they become a starker contrast when you place them together. And the crowds actually reinforce. I was thinking about this earlier, and I feel like the journalists, especially when they're pounding on top of the divers when they come out the caves, that it emphasizes the pressure on them, the mental pressure that was on them. You've got the physical pressure inside the caves with what they're dealing with, but I work with Chris Burden quite a lot here, trying to thread in all the lines of dialogue so that you would hear what each journalist was saying, but it wouldn't be overwhelming, and so that you can't tell what each is saying. But we mount it as they're walking down. You see it gets more and more and more till it's overwhelming for them. So we made this ramp up, both when they first come out, when they know the boys are alive, but they secretly feel like there might not be anything they can do about it, and when the last boy is out and the news spreads. It's something Ron was very keen on showing as well, that this is a big camp and the news spreads and grows to an extreme point at the end. Chris, you can talk a bit about that weave.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the finding the boys, because personally, I remember when I first ever watched it, it was just the most emotional one or two or three bits where I absolutely was welling up. It's phenomenally powerful. And it's only now I kind of realize, sometimes with more discussions, the quiet that we established in there allowed us to have layers of beautiful, subtle emotion from the boys. It was just whispers. If you had anything like that, you couldn't even give any countenance to that happening outside with the rains and all that. Any emotion like that, we just had this beautiful magnifying glass available to us that allowed us, and it would happen scene after scene in that environment. The scariest place they were in, this is potentially the place they're going to die, was a place of serenity where their coach was doing this amazing work, meditation and so on. So right from the first time we're in there, that first scene when you see them and you realize they're alive, you just hear the whispers, you hear the detail of these little kids, and and then some of them, and you hear the language, the subtlety that one of them can communicate in English comes up. You hear the space, and it extends and it goes further. I can just grab other scenes in there where there's the humor of Harry telling the story again and again about the football and about, did you believe Belgium won again? Can you believe it? And then you can have those layers of subtlety where there's still whispers of things going on. Is it me going to be the next one? So that was just wonderful to have this kind of almost like theatrical stage with beautiful, subtle water just surrounding us. It's still this ridiculously dangerous, terrifying place, but kind of beautiful, because the emotions were so strong in there. And so for us, kind of emotionally, artistically, and technically, we could just do things in there that the other settings were not designed to allow, really, which was fabulous.
Well, when we first started putting that scene together, there was actually quite a lot of running water in that scene. Like early editions of that mix, we were trying to connect, what was going on outside the caves with the monsoon season and coming into, and connecting the fact that this cave system is filling up quick. And so, early versions of the mix where they, Rick and John come out and they're meeting them for the first time, there is a lot of water going on. And so we soon realized that actually we wanted to create a different kind of space, and it didn't need to have, that kind of tension building up at that point. It wasn't, that scene isn't about that. And it was more about, like creating that space of serenity and, kind of like another character in the film, like Ron was saying, this is a new space. This is and a kind of intrigue to it and a suspense to it as they're coming up, and are they in there, are they not? And you kind of start to hit you, or rather than being distracted by the fact that the cave system is filling up and hearing all this water gushing down, there are just small subtle bits of that still going on, but it's more about hearing those kind of like the voices appearing and the kind of the subtle little footsteps and everything. And as we cut back into that scene throughout the later parts of the film, we start to establish the kind of the water in there filling up as we're kind of building to the climax of the movie. Is it's time to get the boys out and this cave system is filling up, but it wasn't necessary in that earlier scene.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of sort of discoveries along the way, and again, it had to do with focus. And of course, I directed it with a sense of what we wanted to focus on. I wanted to make this a ride, So on the one, that's again the value of telling it as a narrative story. You make it entertaining and engrossing, and people kind of lose themselves in what the cinema can do to make it an entertaining and fascinating. And the ideas behind it, the themes behind it, and sometimes even land with more power because they're kind of coming in almost through a subconscious section of the brain. But things like the water, that was a discovery that, again, as was said, the initial idea was let's right away introduce how, intense that is. But we pulled back on it. And then I remember one day James came in after a screening, and we needed to find a way to make that final day to recognize how treacherous it still was. The divers were exhausted. The rain was on its way now. The monsoons had hit, and they weren't going to let up, and they didn't let up in reality. Within another 2 days, it was completely flooded, and they never would have gotten anybody out. But and James came in one day and said, the water is the new villain now, and now we got to let it out. And we found ways visually to enhance, that, but to give sound this opportunity to sort of take advantage of the fact that we'd held back and really, really, flood our senses with that as a danger.
Yeah, we had a lot of opportunity for sonic contrast. When the divers were first finding the boys on that 10th day, and then when they leave, this moment always sticks with me, how we sit in black and how they say thank you, and then they leave, and it's just the loneliest feeling that you get from their point of view, what it must have been like, just a glimpse of what they had been suffering through for 10 days with no other human contact. But it also speaks a little to the culture and those boys in there, that when we find them, we didn't come upon them with them arguing or fighting or wondering, when they were going to get out or anything like that. There was a serenity to it. And I think that spoke volumes about the culture, those kids, the coach's ability to keep those kids calm and believing that somehow, some way, without him knowing, that they were going to get through there. And then by contrast, by the time we got to, there's 7 dives in the film. So we've talked all along about differentiating those dives and through different points of view and being subjective throughout the whole experience. But by the time we got to that last day, day 18, there's rain and then there's monsoon rains. And people have to understand that this was not a foolhardy thing that the boys did by going into the caves, and that in Thailand, when the monsoons happen, this is rain like most of us don't know. So it's disastrous. If they would have not been able to get the boys out, as Ron said, they would have, a couple of days later, they probably wouldn't have survived it. So the ability to just kind of pivot back and forth as the story required. And yes, we did learn these things along the way. Once we got better shape to the film, what really we needed and where we needed.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought up that sequence. And you talk about the loneliness after the divers establish contact, when they leave and the boys are still there. And I'm haunted by that image of them one by one turning out their flashlights, and we go back into darkness. And it's just, it was such an emotional moment. But Ron, to your point, so simple, just really simple storytelling, but it's so powerful.
And I also want to point out how powerful the story is, in that when Ron just said 2 days later, the cave was fully flooded. I actually got goosebumps, and I've seen the film many times, so it just goes to show.
It was great having Rick Stanton and Jason Mallinson around, because they were not only there to help make sure that the diving was accurate and that the diver's technique was right, and that we understood what the threats and the complications were and the procedure of it all. But even though, they're not guys that dwell on emotions very much as individuals, but nonetheless, on the day that we were actually shooting the scene that you're talking about with the flashlights, I just remember Rick talking about, how sure he wasn't sure he'd ever see those boys again, and he knew he was leaving them in the dark, and they gave him another flashlight or two, but he just thought it was a hopeless scenario, and he was pretty shattered by that, turned away. And I just thought, leave them in the dark. And of course, there's going to be a moment of leaving them in the dark, but there's that, and then there's sort of making a moment that will allow that sort of focus, and so it just fed that notion of the flashlights kind of coming out, just slowly disappearing until we were in the complete darkness.
One of the first things that you notice when you watch this movie is there's a lot of rain. This movie obviously takes place in Thailand during the monsoon season, and rain is a pretty ubiquitous presence that starts at the beginning of the movie and goes more or less in and out through the entire film. And I think for those in the sound community, rain is particularly tricky. It can be kind of monotonous sounding. And so I would love, Rachael and Oliver, maybe you can start us off by just talking about, how you approached having this much rain in the film, and how did you keep it interesting? And I guess obviously also it's notorious when there are that many rain gigs on a set that the production tracks are pretty challenged. So maybe you can talk to us about handling all of that.
Sure. Just in terms of the, adding sound of rain in, just to keep it as varied as possible, obviously. But it was to try and establish, we really wanted it to feel like a sudden downpour, that this wasn't a reckless excursion from the boys. So it did happen, the monsoon season came in early, and so they were caught out rather than doing something foolish. So we really wanted to sell that idea of incredibly hard rain. Also then to the early part of the logistic, everyone turning up to try and help to compromise that with the mud, with tires sliding everywhere. But as much as anything, we wanted it's hitting everything and permeating everything. So just varying all the surfaces, but everything is feeding into water, traveling through the rock and filling up the cave. And basically the water is the antagonist in the film. And we're basically just wanting to hear this extreme water feeding into this thing down there that they're having to battle against to get to the boys. So, and that all the heavy currents and turbulence that you feel in there, whether it's dripping down the caves, everything is being fed from above. So it was really important early on just to show that whether it's where the camp is, up on the mountainside, everything is just being hit incredibly hard.
And from the dialogue side, rain absolutely was something I didn't want. It was a huge challenge, really. But we talked with the production recordist, Paul Brinkat, from the beginning, because he knew he would be facing this on a daily basis. And even in the war room where they're having discussions, right, who's going to go in, how do we get the boys out? There's rain going on top of that everywhere. So pretty much almost every scene has it. And it was a huge cleanup job because the pressure was on to maintain the original production, more so even than usual, because the divers, I'm talking about Vigo and Colin, they said that with these beautiful sets and all the diving training they had, it felt like they didn't have to force their performance. They could it just live naturally in them. So you really don't want to have to get them in 6 months later in their joggers in LA if you can at all help it. So we clean up as best we could, but eventually we had to admit defeat on certain lines, certain key lines. And yeah, there was a lot of ADR, and Chris Burden here was very good at blending in the hundreds and hundreds of lines that there ended up being. And Vigo even flew in especially for 2 full days of ADR to London with us, just to be in the room with us because he's such a pro. And yeah, it was a big challenge. I'm sure Chris can talk a bit more about blending that in.
I mean, yeah, I'm sort of grateful that Rachel's such a superstar in terms of delivering such a sort of good, well, it's a ridiculously high level of cleanup that it retains all of the quality of the originals as much as we could, and then. And she also had some ambiences set up and so on the originals. And it was bit by bit, the ADR would come in and we'd realise where we would replace it. So it was a little bit of an evolution. But again, it was actually, I was just looking at some of the making of, just to remind myself a bit about this. We got lucky in the interiors, actually, the originals didn't have a sort of false ambience to them because the sets were so brilliant and the water in there and everything. So actually, when we were bedding the ADR in with the originals, there was a lot of sort of protection and lots of devices we could use to just merge all the performances where we needed to we'd work constantly on clarity and just, again, chip away at it throughout the whole process.
The reverbs on the dialogues, Hugo Adams, who's our Foley supervisor, went down to Wookey Hole, which is a cave system in England, and did some great IRs of the different cave spaces from the back of the cave, from the front, all different sides. And we use that in conjunction with a few other reverbs to give each space, when they emerge through the caves, a unique shape, if it's a long tunnel or it's a tiny space, because there's a lack of lighting. There has to be in these shots. So the voices tell you what the shape of the space is straight away as they come up. And that really helped. And that was something Ron actually specifically wanted, which I find amazing. He's got the time and the mental capacity to come up with these notes from the beginning. And he was quite right, as he always is.
That must have felt very gratifying to you to know that all that hard work was appreciated back in Thailand. So, obviously, look, we're here to talk about the sound. Let's get underwater. And normally I kind of wait to introduce Dolby to Atmos as a topic for us to talk about, but Atmos, it turns out, is pretty important in this film, especially in the underwater sequences. And so, the thing that I noticed right away is this is not sort of a National Geographic beautiful coral reef diving underwater experience. The underwater sequences in this film are very harrowing and really terrifying. So talk to me about, and there's a lot of this movie that takes place underwater. So how did you go about building that library, getting those elements and handling the mixing of the underwater sequences?
I had a Zoom call with Ron really early on, with James was on that as well. And I think there was an awareness that there was going to be a lot of diving in the film, obviously, and we needed to keep it interesting, and there had to be a narrative quality to it. As you said, it had to feel dangerous and threatening. So the first thing I did after the Zoom call was just look at what the natural properties of sound, how it behaves underwater. And the two big kind of things that informed us in terms of our approach to the sound design were that a lot of the way we register sound is bone conductivity behind the ear rather than just hearing in a normal way. And that means reduced frequency. So we had a very mid-centric kind of sound. But the other one is due to the increased speed of sound underwater, that we aren't calibrated to discern very easily where the sound is coming from. It's like, if you cover one eye, your depth perception goes, and it's a little bit the same if a sound wave hits both ears exactly at the same time because it's going so fast. You can't say, what's the delta here? How we know it's here or we know it's there. So that really helped early on. We were trying a few scenes out the way we were designing it, and by not knowing exactly where everything is, by having a much more diverged soundscape in there, it takes away the sense that you're used to of just going, if I hear something, I know where it is. And it's a classic horror film thing to do, is just have abstract sounds. And if we have a sound in there, there's a reason it's happening, whether it's someone pulling on a rope or there's silt coming or something, or the tank clangs, but it's not necessarily tied to a place that the audience goes, oh, that's happening on the right-hand side of the screen, or that they have to look for it. It feels a little bit more interactive. And having that made made it feel more subjective as an audience, and that was important for us to try and do. That we really wanted to sell the idea of what it would be like in that environment for the audience. So I think those two things really, that very mid-centric thing that everything sat in that one band without that definition we're used to, and it could be coming from anywhere. Definitely, was a useful thing. And Mike Fenton designed the sound with me, and then Will came along as the effects mixer. And we basically all got on board with that. So maybe, Will, if you want to talk about the mix side of that as well.
Yeah, I think the concept for this kind of diverged, environment came up quite early on. I think it was the first attempt we'd sort of just started discussing it with James and Ron and coming up with this idea to help, distinguish this as a completely different environment to the above ground. We want to create this kind of whole new world that no one has ever experienced other than these guys. And obviously that's quite a challenge for us because we've never been in that situation, and a lot of people haven't been in that situation. So trying to create, a cinematic, immersive experience as well as be true to, that exact environment was quite a tricky thing to come up with. So obviously we could go with the idea that, sound does travel 4 or 5 times faster underwater. So let's start playing around with some of the sounds that the guys have come up with and start sort of placing them in the room in this diverged way. So taking a lot of the kind of ambient sounds, the background noises, the particles, all the silt, all that stuff that's kind of like in the water, and placing that within the room in the space in kind of different amounts, and not applying the same amount of divergence to each thing, so everything's kind of got its own randomness in place in the room. And then when it came down to the actual spot effects, whether it's the rope that's being pulled on or whether it's the tank clangs, and it's those things all had varying amounts of like panning, whether it's coming from the heights, from surrounds and fronts, all applied in different ways to create this sense of wherever you're sat in the room, you're not quite sure where that sound's coming from, and you are looking for it. And it's this kind of otherworldly space, and things like the breaths and all that, and those kind of things in the bubbles. We kind of kept a lot of the time quite focused on the sensor, so it kind of did still connect you to the characters, because that was an important thing that we were trying to, despite creating this, this environment that you've never experienced, we also wanted to keep you connected to the story and what's going on. So it was this real fine balance is telling this story, and they're kind of going through the cave. It's a hard thing to describe because it's such a claustrophobic environment. They visually couldn't really see too much, but sonically we were trying to help the audience kind of go through what these guys are going through. And you have these POV shots, when we cut to those, we can kind of like go inside the mask, and we have the breaths kind of coming all from around us, so it feels like you're actually there experiencing what they're doing, going through those stalactites. So it was a real kind of challenge to get that right. Unfortunately, Rick and John had heard the film and had Oliver had gone and recorded a bunch of stuff with them, and they were really kind of happy with the way that it turned out, and did say that they was as close as what we could what they experienced in real life, which was quite a compliment.
Other than more tank clangs, which we thought we'd gone pretty OTT on the tank clangs as it was, but apparently if you're in those scenarios, you cannot have too many tank clangs. So I think, and it just sells that cumbersome, even though you're in water and you're being suspended to some degree, it's just, you've got these tanks flailing around and incredibly tight spaces, so that ever-present feeling that it feels like this world is caving in on you whilst the water's gushing at you and the particles everywhere. So it did feel like a hostile environment. And in that recording session we did with John Valentin, it was quite because we'd looked up the theoretical side of how the sound in water would behave, but we actually, when we set up 2 pairs of hydrophones, one at one end and one at the other end of the big cave pool, it really didn't matter where John was doing what he was doing. And when we got them back into Pro Tools, they both almost sounded identical, it is really odd the way that, and we've all heard that if you're in a swimming pool and someone jumps in and you're underwater, you hear the noise, but you don't know exactly where it's from. But it was, you kind of don't think about it until you have to. And this film definitely made us do that. Yeah.
I love what you're talking about in terms of using the sound, because obviously it was very dark and it's murky. And so you were able to build a more broad and detailed sonic environment to orient the audience and let them know what's going on. And I love what you're talking about, then you had the perspective inside the mask and you can give people the subjective experience of it. But also you're using sound and the sound design in a really emotional way as well, not only for the tension, but I just was really struck by the scene. And obviously we'll post this after, the movie's already streaming, so we won't worry about spoilers. But there's that just extraordinary sequence, when the Navy SEALs are diving and someone, who is kind of a heroic character for us, gets caught and drowns. And that sequence is so beautiful from a sonic perspective. And can you just break that down for us and how you approach that sequence and what you felt you needed to accomplish from a sound perspective?
Sure. It's a real event. So I think key was to be respectful with it. And so I think we wanted, it's a tragic event that occurred. And so we made the event that leads to the air being spent, that was quite a frenetic event. And then basically with all that noise that's happening there, we just started stripping layers away. The music is in there for that spell. We hear the music start to dissipate away. We start to hear him, the air supply depleting, and that sort of extra strain on the regulator. And then eventually you're just hearing him drift into basically silence with that one last tank clang as it sort of scrapes down, and then a little beat just to register what had happened. But it's after you're so aware of all these scuba breaths all the way through the film that to actually go to silence like that, you're suddenly aware of your own breathing, which was quite a powerful thing, I think.
Well, I know we're coming to the end of our time. Ron, I just want to wrap up with a question for you. You're well known in the sound community for using sound as a great storytelling tool. And this particular film, as I said, was just such a spectacular experience in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. So I would love to hear from you just how those two tools, Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, were important to you in telling this particular story.
Now the truth is going to be revealed in that I don't know very much about sound, but I know a lot about the experience of being in an audience, and I know a lot about the sort of the nuances of storytelling, and I know that it's a little mysterious. It's almost like music to me, where I'm not a musician. I understand how that it works. I can help, but mostly I just have to have creative conversations. And that's what I've learned to do over the years, frankly, in the areas where, visual effects, music and sound design, where I really have to just talk to the artist as though they're actors, really, or writers, their colleagues in this storytelling process. And I find that exciting and stimulating. And of course, often the picture editors, they contribute mightily, and early on. But I love to get the sound design team in as early as possible and begin seeing cuts, even if it's not their sound effects, if it's temp, everything's temp, because it just initiates a conversation that can run a little bit deeper. So it's not about just scrambling around at the end. That's generally not where the really impactful conceptual ideas come from. So it's I love the collaboration, and I've continued to enjoy it and be kind of tickled, because when these things work, it's great in a way that I don't exactly know how they did it, because it's like, wow, okay, surprise, touchdown, next scene.
As a music dialogue mixer, I've actually retained that sort of kind of magical, the response to the magic that comes typically from my right-hand side, from Ollie and Will and his team and the sound designers. And I kind of blissful ignorance often how the design has happened and it's come together. And it's like a musical kind of overture occurs with all these multiple layers. And I love that, I really do. And I sincerely kind of, I sort of enjoy a bit of ignorance of where it's come from, and I should be technical about what I do, but I quite enjoy that, and it's similar thing, Ron. So I enjoy that.
Yeah, it was actually it was a big moment in we were still shooting, I believe, and when first sort of notion of a rough sequence came to us from a design standpoint, and we kind of gathered around, to listen, and it was like Christmas morning or something, because we were all just smiling at what it meant. And then Ben Wallfish heard it, and he said, in this sequence, I think you're going to want to feature that. And I know we talked about this being, heavily music, but I don't think we should. And very early on we realized, well, great, whatever they're doing, whatever they're understanding and sharing is really working because it's transporting us and we're all feeling it. And that's what the film needed.
Dolby, in terms of utilization of Dolby Atmos as a format on this mix is, probably the most extreme we've gone to with the use of it. It lends itself perfectly for it because we're trying to produce something incredibly immersive. And so therefore, a format where you've got, the bass managed surrounds, more speakers, everything is there to allow you to achieve this. So, we kind of pushed it to the extreme, those moments where you're underwater, it's all channels going all the time with all this diverged audio that's going on. But obviously, a big part of doing that, knowing where it's going to go. This is an Amazon show and it's going to end up on a streaming service like a lot of things do now. And so a big part of while we were doing this was considering the home experience as well and how we can get what we're experiencing in a big room, recreate that best at home. It wasn't just a case of okay, there's the theatrical mix, let's send it out. We spent a lot of time in a home theater doing the home Atmos mix. And, taking bounces of that and having a listen to it on sound bars and doing multiple things to kind of make sure that it's, where we might have lost some low frequencies and some of the kind of diverged stuff, making sure we can kind of try and recreate that. So we were taking low, subharmonic generators and feeding the effect stem through, pitching it down, trying to kind of recreate that experience that we were all having in a big room.
Thank you once again to Ron, James, Chris, William, Rachel, and Oliver for joining us today. An extra special thanks to our friends at Prime Video for helping us put this conversation together. As I mentioned up top, 13 Lives is available to watch right now on Prime Video. As always, we'll have a link for you in our show notes. And if you haven't already, please make sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. Awards season is upon us once again, and you can expect more big conversations here in the coming weeks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. This has been the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with production support by Taylor Hines. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thank you again for listening.